Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion of functional dependencies by having a look at the Cape Cod database. We're going to find some functional dependencies here too. And I realize that right now this all seems very abstract to you, like what's the point of all this? And all I can say is that at this point, what we use the functional dependencies for is to redesign table structures. What you'll learn later is how to take what you found as a functional dependency within a table to make new tables and make the design better. So for now, what we're going to have to stick with is learning to identify functional dependencies. So moving on, let's have a look at SKU data. You guys are very familiar with this table by now. You're probably sick of seeing it. So let's get started. Again, we've discussed how to determine what a functional dependency looks like, and that is this field always this when that field is always that? So let's have a look. When SKU, if we know what the SKU is, what else can we determine? So for the SKU 202,000, do we always have the half dome temp vestibule? That's an interesting word too, vestibule. Anyway, well, there's only the one SKU of that, so I would have to say yes. And we can look at other examples too. Don't just look at the one that you pick out to look at. Look at others as well. And as a matter of fact, SKU is unique. So to give you a hint, SKU is actually going to be a determinant of all of the rest of these things. So SKU 201 1000 is always a half dome tent. Okay. Well, is it always camping? Yes, it's the only one. Is it always Cindy Low? Yes, it's the only one. So we can say SKU also determines department, and SKU also determines buyer. Just as a hint for you guys, if you look at the design, we notice that SKU is the primary key. So that, as a result, must be unique. And when we're looking at the data, the key always determines everything else in the table, because that is what we've determined that the primary key does, is it uniquely identifies a record in a table. So the primary key in general always determines everything else. And again, this can be expressed in shorthand, SKU description, and department, and buyer. This is the same thing as this. It's just shorter. Now, that being said, I'm going to give you another example that we were playing around with earlier, and that is the quantity times price equals extended price formula. That does not mean this. And I'm going to put this up nice and huge for those people who aren't actually listening to me. Just because this breaks apart, this does not. This means you must know both to determine the other side. This means SKU determines any of these. All of these determine this. It depends on what's on the left-hand side and what's on the right-hand side. And we call that the determinant and the dependent. So, to follow the example, kind of wish I hadn't deleted that earlier now. this is true, this is not. So back to what we were doing earlier. So we've already identified this dependency within the data. So let's continue on. And literally, we're just going to look at this field by field. SKU description. Well, it's not a key, but we can tell from looking at the data that the SKU description is also unique. So unfortunately, it too is going to determine everything else, because there's only the one yellow standard scuba tank, and the SKU and the department and buyer are always the same because there's only the one record. So in that sense, we can also say SKU description also determines SKU and department and buyer. Moving on. Department. If I say water sports, will you always say small clear dive mask? No. Will you always say the same SKU? No. Will you always say the same buyer? No. So department doesn't determine anything. And we can look at other examples too. Now we see here, if I say camping, you're always going to say Cindy Lowe, because she's, well, I assume it's a she, is the only one associated with camping. But in order for it to be a functional dependency, it must be true for all records. So just because it's true for camping and climbing doesn't mean it's a functional dependency, because it's not true for water sports. So that's an important distinction. So let's think about buyer. If I say Pete Hansen, will you always say 101 100? No, because he's also got this one. He also has two different SKU descriptions, but he's always got the same department. Okay, what about Nancy Myers? If I say Nancy Myers, will you always say water sports? Yeah. What about Cindy Lowe and camping? Yeah. Jerry Martin and climbing? Yeah. So we can say then that buyer determines department, because if I know who the buyer is, I know who the department is. So this is an example of how to identify functional dependencies in the SKU data table. In the next lesson, we're going to go through this again using order item. Stay tuned.